All right, welcome to The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll be your co-hosts as we explore topics related to the end of the world through the lens of media, particularly films, literature, and television programs, with also occasional sidelines into historical examples of apocalyptic or near apocalyptic or apocalyptic seeming events.
Right, and I think we'll also touch on, when there are, related news items that come up as we approach the looming end of the world. We'll cover those as well.
Yeah, as they arise. The beginning of the show, we'll probably spend a few minutes discussing any relevant doomsday events on the horizon before jumping for the rest of the episode into a consideration of whatever the pre-assigned topic for the week is. What drew you to want to talk about this topic, Michael?
Well, I mean, a few things. I think the first thing is that there's been this real sort of proliferation of this content. I don't know, over the last decade or two, it feels like it's moved squarely into both the mainstream and even sort of like higher brow television, literature, and film. What used to sort of be, apocalyptic content was sort of, whether it was nerdy or niche, right, fantastical.
Yeah.
Has sort of become realistic and grimy, and it sort of, I think, speaks to the overall dystopian view that we all, or many of us, actually now carry around with us every day.
Yeah, so this topic, which was once sort of on the periphery in horror films, science fiction, epics, things of that nature, has now become the territory of like prestige television and legitimately considered artistic films as opposed to sort of this schlockier kind of grindhouse sort of
Right.
history of the genre. Yeah, I think that's relevant, and I think the reasons for this are, quite obvious. On the one hand, the rise of climate change, the seeming disintegration of institutions that once seemed reliable, particularly in the American context, but I think that's also something that's happening more globally as well. The center doesn't hold, to borrow a phrase from
Yeah,
Yeats.
and I think too, there is the element of our conception of what is going to transpire. I'm sort of fascinated by this feeling that I don't know if this has existed at any other point in history where most, or many people at least, sort of go around with the underlying notion that in their lifetime, or at least in the lifetime of their children, um, there's going to be some sort of catastrophic meltdown of institutions, of the very workings of society. And it's interesting, I think, to start to look at how fiction, or in some cases nonfiction, how we approach that, how we conceive of it, and what the limitations of our conceptions are.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think in the past there certainly were, there have been doomsday cults for centuries, if not millennia, right? People who were of the strong, firm belief the world would end, imminently. But as you say, I think those people were previously very much on the periphery, where now it feels like even just in sort of mainstream society, it's not so crazy to think about the potential for cataclysm.
Right. There's like that sort of slightly banal notion, right? That life is becoming a Black Mirror episode, and
Right,
that
right.
maybe like Black Mirror stopped hitting so hard as the world we live in seemed to converge on the sort of dark dystopian nightmare that it was portraying when it first came onto
Right.
the scene.
Black Mirror is no longer powerful because life has kind of caught up to Black Mirror, right?
Yeah,
Like art
exactly.
is imitating life, life is imitating art, and now, they're too similar. It's hard to discern where the one ends and the other begins in a way. So
Yeah.
for our first episode, we're taking a little bit of an unconventional choice. We're talking about the 2016 film directed by Denis Villeneuve, Arrival. And what was it that you were the one to suggest this, Michael? What is about Arrival that you think is a
Well,
useful entry point for our conversations?
there are a couple things. The first is that it's a little more grounded than your typical alien invasion movie, right?
Yeah,
At least
yeah.
it sort of claims to be, right? And so
It's the
what
thinking man's alien movie.
yes, this is no Mars attacks, right? This is
Yeah,
this is an actual, I think, imagination of how things might actually unfold if this type of alien contact was made. And at the same time, I think what is sort of very much in tune with the overall idea of the podcast is, as we'll talk about, the sort of the seeming limitations of the writer and the movie when it comes to act like crossing the premise and moving through how both the protagonist and society at large like reacts, to what's happening. And I think that speaks to our idea of part of the struggle with coping with the seeming end times that we exist in, is a real imagination gap, both socially, politically, economically, or what have you.
yeah. So the film, in some ways, is not fully able to process the like reality or the implications of what such
Right.
a
And what's interesting about this one is
and,
that
the,
it kind of thinks it is
yeah,
doing.
yeah, and those limitations or those inabilities to process are themselves revelatory, right? They show us something about the kind of limits of apocalyptic thinking, limits of
Right.
our imagination, and yeah, yeah. So the film is really interesting. It centers on a character portrayed by Amy Adams, who's great in the movie, and I'm a big fan of her work overall. But it's a little bit of an odd entry point into the apocalypse, right? We open up with the aliens have arrived. The arrival sort of has already happened, right? And Amy Adams is a linguist. She's a teacher. She teaches a class at a university that's on sort of the history of language, the interrelationships of languages, the language trees, various hypotheses that have developed over time about what the nature of the way we speak tells us about how we see the world, things like this. But she gets to class and there's like five students. Presumably it's in a giant lecture hall. Presumably it's a class that has like hundreds of people. And
Yeah.
as we see her walking in, there are people crowded around TVs.
Right. Like she already hasn't heard, which
Yeah,
is a little bit of a leap because one would assume that if a group of people are sort of huddled around a television, which by the way is just like randomly on
in
the
the in the
news
in the
in the
middle
middle
of
of this
the
student center,
university. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, that no one has sort of like tapped her on the shoulder and been like, it appears as though aliens have arrived.
Right,
So she
right.
makes
Did you
it, she
hear
makes
the
it,
news?
yeah. So she makes it all the way into the class, which is the first, bit of
Sort of
stretch. But
oddity. Yeah.
right, but again, it's 2016. It's not quite the like omnipotence of social media. Maybe there's a
I mean,
chance,
social media was very present in our lives in 2016, but it has
but
become
maybe
much
not for
more
a
so.
maybe not for a linguist professor who clearly
Who's
like
who's in her
keeps to
30s or
herself.
40s or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and is like, sort of
TikTok,
dealing.
TikTok did not yet exist,
And
so
she's very removed and with reason. Like she's processing. It appears at the beginning of the movie she's like processing the loss of a child. We're not
right.
sure how
There are
how recent that is.
flashbacks in the beginning that are that indicate to us part of the reason she's not maybe so up on the news is that she's overcome with recovering the aftermath of some kind of tragedy. We see a daughter who's
Right,
ill. We see her growing up. We see her in a hospital. It seems that the daughter has passed away. And
right.
that is, I think, understandable, right? The
Yeah, and
idea
I
of,
think that's used to suggest that she has these blinders on, but it starts to get to the point a little incredulity, right? When she comes in and again, there's five kids there, and she just sort of starts in on
she's
her
like,
lecture.
what's the history of romance languages or like whatever?
Yeah,
And
she starts speaking about Portuguese, right?
right, right. And
And then you hear these like a couple cell phones going off, right?
And then one of the
And
students is
finally,
like, "Can you turn on the news?" And she's like,
can you turn on the news channel? Which is a great line. I love that.
yeah, yeah. Just because there's just a TV that gets television
Cable.
channels in
It
the
does appear as much.
as the classrooms are wired. This is I'm a teacher by trade, and I have yet to have a classroom that is fully wired for cable. One can dream. But yeah, so they learned that these objects have appeared around the world. I think initially they say there are 8 objects. They're
Right.
1,500 feet tall, and they've appeared at seemingly random places around the world. I think eventually it's expanded that there are in fact 12 objects, right? That they appear to be alien ships of some kind.
Right. And
And
they're hovering and they're not giving any information.
they're not doing anything. They're just kind of
They're not explaining themselves.
right. They're just there, and
Which I think is important to point out because it is one of the things that differentiates from, other classic attack based
War of
alien
the
invasion.
Worlds or
Yeah,
things of that age.
Independence Day,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
like the idea is that any potentiality sort of looms over the arrival. They could be
That's right.
aggressive, they could be peaceful, they could be seeking something, they could be ready to harvest our organs for energy.
They're here to
Nobody
steal our
knows.
minerals or resources. We don't know.
Right. Right. And that sort of goes to my first point is that we don't know anything, and that's purposeful, but our protagonist, for all intents and purposes, like, yeah, she ends her class early. She's willing to do that. And everybody's sort of strolling out of the class. And you're sort of seeing these weird kind of like sporadic signs of urgency. A car runs into another car in the parking lot for some reason,
Right.
right?
There's military jets are heard flying over.
Yeah.
We're so people are reacting, but not very quickly, right? I mean,
No,
I
I mean,
think
she goes back home, goes back home, right? She just gets a glass of red and sits and watches the news. I mean,
and
that's how
then
she's sort of like,
amazingly the next day she goes back to work.
she goes right back to work, despite like starting to get some information,
Yeah.
right? Like the first thing she listens to is this press secretary type who is, delivering a very like, again, like quotidian sounding, sort of press read
Almost as if
where,
like, well, there's been a tragic earthquake in
yeah, yeah,
California.
that's right.
FEMA
That's
is
right.
on the
Like,
scene or
right.
whatever.
There's been an air crash, and like
Yeah,
obviously we're like doing an independent investigation.
yeah,
And
yeah.
there's that great line where the press secretary tries to assure everybody to not panic,
Oh,
right?
because
Because
we have protocols in
we
place
have
for
protocols, which is absolutely hysterical to
That's
think
great.
of, right?
Oh, like being in on the planning mission. So, like, what do we do when the 12 alien objects land and are not
Right,
interacting with
right. And
us?
it really does like it does sort of draw a immediate comparison, I think, for us in the real world to our experience of 9/11,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I
Because
think, yeah, like we're both old enough that we've lived through disasters. Recently COVID's a little different, sort of slow moving disaster. 9/11 is the obvious point of reference for
yeah, I
like
think that's right.
pseudo apocalyptic event.
But of course, like
Um,
what's amazing to consider is that like their whole defense of their lack of preparedness for 9/11 was exactly the lack of protocol
they did
and
not in fact
imagination.
have the
Yeah. Oh,
protocols in place.
we just couldn't even have imagined planes running into the World Trade Center. Like this was a bridge too far, but apparently they've got protocols for when,
For when
12
they
alien vessels hover at seemingly random places around the world. But it did make me think about our experience in 9/11 because while I was watching it, rewatching it recently, the first inclination is to kind of ridicule how she reacted, right?
Right, because she's incredibly passive. She
Yeah.
has like she's almost flat affect in the face of this.
Despite the fact that as we get into the movie, her single biggest, to her credit, character trait is her intuition, her
Yeah.
gut, you know. But apparently she's not ready to like turn on the intuition
Yeah, she's
when
just
there's
like she's just
yeah. For
yeah,
now,
she's in
like
airplane mode or
that's right.
whatever.
For now, it's just Merlot and just get the facts. But I think about I know everyone has like a 9/11 story, but I think mine really speaks to the possibility that, like, for all the flaws in the movie that I find later on, that maybe this wasn't so far away
Yeah.
from how some people would react. I remember I was a senior in high school when this was happening, and I was growing up in suburban Ontario, like an hour outside Toronto, and uh, we would have these when you were a senior, you could take spare periods, and the spare periods would alternate between the first period and the last one, which means some students wouldn't arrive until homeroom, which was, right around the time of this attack taking place.
Yeah.
And the way that the class I was in was actually U.S. history, and the way that our
Perfect.
teacher, yeah, it's just amazing. The way that it would start every day is our teacher, Mr. Wilson, he would do current events, and he would try to engage the kids by getting them to talk about something. And sometimes it was about history, current actual political events or what have you, but sometimes it was just like a kid would explain that the field hockey team won, so it was
Sure, sure.
very low stakes. It was just to get some engagement going with these kids in the morning. And this kid is in our class. His name's Adam, and he was really sweet kid, really introverted, very quiet. And he sat at the back, and he rarely offered up information. And the class starts, and people do start just saying random things from the previous day. Um, when he's sort of in the back holding his hand up very shyly,
Uh-huh.
and three or four people have done their routine thing, contributing.
Michael
And but
Jordan is ending his retirement for
yeah,
this.
yeah, exactly. Right. And so the teacher calls on Adam finally, and he very sheepishly and confusedly, which I think is fair, he says, well, they say it could be an accident, but right before I came to class, a plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And, obviously the teacher, I still remember, like, the expression on his face was like half like, some kids might try to fuck with me, but not Adam,
Yeah.
So, like, he wouldn't do this, but like, what the hell are you talking about? Ironically, it's like, it was quite true that he could not have even imagined, right, the
Right,
possibility of a
right,
plane
right.
doing this. And so he asks again, he's like, what? Sorry, what are you talking about?
So
And
he kind of can't process.
he can't process the information, and he's like,
Yeah.
what are you talking about? And Adam says, yeah, a plane ran into the World Trade Center. They think it might be an accident, but then right before I left my house, a second plane ran into the second building.
So sort of like starts to lean against accident, right? Like,
Yeah, and like at this point the teacher's fully like, mouth open, like can't entertain this as real, but can't like ignore it either. And I immediately get up with my friend Dan to leave, because obviously two planes have crashed into the World Trade Center, and this is sort of like
you
the
don't need
definition.
history class. You're living
Yeah,
history
it's like
class.
really is, yeah, it's really unfolding in real time. And I get up and the teacher's like, where do you think you're going? I'm like, I'm gonna go home to watch the news. um and I turned to Adam and I just was like, you're telling me that two planes crashed into the World Trade Center and your first thought was I better get to homeroom? And like, so then when I rewatched Arrival, it was like, oh yeah, like I think people. I mean, I don't think I would. I mean, I reacted the way I react to everything. I fucking panicked. I thought a nuclear war. I thought there'd be a nuclear war by the end of the week. I was
Yeah,
like, holy
yeah,
shit.
yeah.
And I'm. But again, like, I'm running out of the school, and at this point, people are figuring it out. And the principal, comes on the
The
PA,
PA, yeah.
and he like announces to the school, there's truth to the rumors that America has been attacked, and we're getting all the information we can. I want to assure students of Southwood Secondary School that our place of education is not a target. which I, which, like, I guess it's something you say, but like, the idea that Al Qaeda has this list that is like
They're like, all
World
right,
Trade
well, that's
Center.
Ontario Public School.
Yeah, exactly. But
Yeah,
then that watching Arrival back, it's like, oh yeah, okay. There probably would be people who can't process or
yeah.
don't want to.
I think that's very true. And all right, we one thing that's interesting about this is that almost immediately, I think the second day after she goes back to work,
Well,
uh
this is where we get into the ridiculous
where
section.
the military appears.
No, well,
Like,
I mean, no, but for the second day, she goes back to work. I mean, I'm
oh
sorry,
yeah,
but like, surely,
yeah.
surely by then, she knows that there's not going to be class. It's like not even a questionable snow day, right? Like, this is a
Yeah,
huge fucking
yeah,
moment. And
yeah.
like, the school wouldn't be open. It would be locked. The classroom would be locked. Like, how did any of this? She comes back in with the textbook that she's ready to read off of again. And then,
She's like, all right, so yesterday was pretty exciting, guys, but like time to get back
yeah,
to
yeah,
work.
yeah. And guess what? This time there's no one in the class.
Yeah.
So she goes to her office, and I guess she's still got office hours, maybe, in case anyone's got questions about the rating.
She's working on her tenure file. She's got to
Right.
add
But
some.
this is the
some-
first moment. This is the first moment of the movie that really pops out at me. And it's a little bit out of left field, but we see her watching a stream of on her laptop of a newscast,
Yeah.
right? That is explaining the current state of affairs. And my first thought when I was rewatching it was like, how do you dare to open the laptop? You see what I'm
Oh,
saying?
right, right.
How could you dare? Because like this is the overriding problem I have with the movie is that like nobody's considering what might be possible. The truly impossible has happened. But
Right.
then apparently, like, who knows what control the aliens have over our information system? Who knows that maybe if you open the laptop, like I'm scared enough, to get one of those like malwares that tell you they like caught, they've got you on your webcam jerking off, and if you don't send $50,000, you're gonna send it to your entire friends and family. Like I'm already worried about that stuff. You're telling me that aliens come as
So
though
if
they
aliens
wouldn't.
appear, you're not like logging in to Facebook or whatever.
Maybe they could blow up your laptop.
Yeah,
You have
that's
no
true.
idea what they are capable of. And yet you're just willy-nilly like opening yourself up to sending and receiving data packets? Not a fucking chance in hell am I doing that.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. But we also learned some information from her stream, which is that the president has declared a state of emergency.
Well,
Uh,
yes,
a
but we
full
also learned
48 hours after the arrival of these
yeah,
aliens.
yeah. I think that sort of like also speaks to the way that the movie squarely feels of an earlier time. Like I think you get a sense that this
Yeah.
movie's coming out. It's like 2016. It's being filmed in 2015. It's very much of the pre-Trump, pre
Yeah, I
like
think the
social
media,
media.
like, we could talk about the media now because I think it's one of the themes we both found really hilarious about this film. That, it's a very good-looking movie. It
Yep.
feels contemporary for the most part visually, but the depiction of the media in it still feels very much locked in a kind of cable news um, hyper social mediatized environment. As far as, pre fake news, pre the sort of
Right.
post-Trump, it's pre the post-Trump, uh like environment in which we have lived since 2016.
And
And
with the government too, right? The idea that they have the steady hand to wait 48 hours to figure out if this is an emergency or not.
right, there's no panic, there's no,
Yeah.
so let's wait and see.
Right.
Yeah, two
Right.
days of the aliens being here, yeah, emergency, okay. um we learn a couple of funny details. Borders are closed, flights have been
Yeah.
grounded.
Yeah. I think for this section, I think what we should really do is just what happens is she gets to watch a rather extended news clip.
Yeah.
Okay. And what is remarkable about it is how, again, how quotidian it is, how similar it is to you might see a report on bad weather, for example,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
like the text of the movie is after Tuesday's extraordinary events, the president this morning declared a state of emergency with as many as 5,000 National Guards being deployed to the state of Montana alone.
5,000. That should hold
Just
them.
5,000. Yeah, that should hold. And then it goes on. It's a borders are closed and flights have been grounded. Reasonable. Okay,
Fair
that's
enough.
good to know. Stranding millions of travelers. I love that. Like the idea that they're
Just
gonna
like
like
people angry trapped in the
yeah,
airport.
yeah. Like they cut to like a reporter at like JFK reminding viewers of like their rights as passengers and like when they can get a refund for their flight. They've got like some like uncle talking about how he's trying to get home for his bowling league championship.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
still in that, right? It's still in that world. It's still like as though that's the type of information people would want at this time. And then the next thing it says, which I also love, um, the newscaster says panic buying of gas, water, and food continues to escalate.
Yeah.
Which, look, I'm sure that there would be a lot of people getting as many resources as possible, right?
Yeah.
My first problem with that is the word panic. I think
Yeah.
it's totally misplaced because I think that the people who are panicked, like how I feel like I would react, absolute paralysis,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I think if
People who
12
are
alien
people
vessels,
who are buying food and stuff, that's actually like
about as reasonable as you can be, and
yeah, yeah.
calm. I mean, the
Yeah.
fact that you're even willing to wade out into that environment. The second one I love is panic buying. So that second word, buying. You're telling me that like you're waiting on, so now we're waiting online with the aliens hovering.
The self checkout is
Yeah.
like
Oh,
fully
my chip's not working. Oh, if you try to, you're gonna have to insert, maybe swipe. Oh, no one. I mean, although I guess if you are buying, you're definitely running up shit on credit, right? Because you're never gonna. That's definitely the move. But, there is this element of trying to portray that things are falling apart, but doing it in like the weirdest. Like I don't know who is writing this A block, but like they're totally disconnected from the reality that would present itself, right? Then again, there's a gem. There's a fucking gem. The very next thing, still in the A block of this newscast, the newscaster announces federal authorities have temporarily lifted all caps on overtime for law enforcement. I mean, think about the level of minutia that like implies that people are still interested in. Like the idea that there are people, they're huddled at home, they've come back with some gas, some water, and food. They're going to hunker down. They turn on the TV. Thankfully, it's still working. By the way,
right.
aliens have apparently not cut off, the cable networks yet. And you see a husband kind of turn to his family and say, do you think that they're do you think that they're going to keep a cap on overtime for law enforcement, or do you think they'll lift that so that law enforcement can work overtime in this trying moment? And then the wife is like, don't worry. From what I've heard, it is a temporary lifting of the cap. So, like, how is that possibly a concern? So then it goes on, and it does hit on something I think is actually pretty important. Says
Yeah.
the ATF has put a temporary ban on new gun licenses. Now,
Oh well,
I mean,
finally.
this is we have now fully entered the
Well,
realm of
there's like
fantasy.
what
Right?
300 mass shootings a year, and like nothing can
Yeah,
be
and
done. But aliens appear, and it's like,
right,
well,
right,
time
right.
to
Like
stop this gun thing.
children being shot, at random in schools couldn't get America to move, but the Second Amendment finally is defeated by aliens arriving.
Yeah,
I
right. They
mean,
haven't
look,
even attacked yet, or whatever. And
like
also, like, wouldn't that be the opposite? Like, wouldn't it be like,
I mean, surely I'm as anti-gun as they come, but like this might be an occasion where I'm at least standing beside a guy with
with
an
the shotgun or
AR-15.
whatever?
Yeah,
Yeah, like,
like I just like but it's also like a reasonable time to have a fairly well-armed militia, I would think. Not that it could, you know, although I guess like it also wouldn't do anything. Like, the idea of like my
you're
shotgun,
shooting like the alien or what?
yeah, just
Like,
like shooting blindly at the vessel, right?
yeah,
Um,
that could be bad.
so so then it goes on to say that this ban of guns, and again, this is still in the A block of this newscast during this incredible emergency. The newscaster has time to let us know that this move against gun licenses has forced, quote, many independent suppliers of hunting equipment and firearms to close their door to the public, which, I mean, look, if I'm a,
You're a
if I'm
gun
a, if
shop owner.
it's just like a red-blooded American. Like no matter what happens, they're still appealing to my sensibility about small business owners. Like like it's gonna like get me out in the primary. It's like, and again, if
People,
I'm
yeah,
an
like
independent,
the hunting shop owners are going to remember this come election
well, to
season or
to say nothing of the idea that they're like gonna willingly open their doors to like a fucking panicked public and be like,
whatever.
come in to where I'm surrounded by all of this ammunition and firearms, and maybe I won't fucking die today. I'm gonna like open my shop.
Yeah.
So then it gets to, I think, what is like our favorite part, right?
Mm.
Which is so in keeping with the humdrum nature of the newscast, even while it's portraying a potentially apocalyptic event. You know how they always talk about the stock market at the end of these
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
sections, right? They
This
still
is
do
great.
that. They actually still do that.
They
And
say
it
the stock market is down. Shares have fallen 10%. right?
Yeah,
Is
right,
that
right, right, right. It's the quote is the Dow Jones industrial average fell over 2,000 points. And we went and we looked, and at the time of filming, that would represent 11%
yeah.
of the stock market. Okay. And it now just for like perspective, Black Monday, 1987, stock market fell 22% because of worries of the strength of the dollar. Okay. So like which again, like fine, okay, you're going to imagine that it only falls 11%, then that's terrible news writing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because if I am writing the A block of this newscast and 12
Right.
alien vessels
Economy
hover
incredibly resilient.
absolutely resolute in the face of the unknown, the stock market and the humble workaday traders on the floor of the stock exchange said, no, we
No,
will
I'm
continue to
standing.
move product. It's like, it really is like
I
this
am not
great,
going to panic sell my shares in
yeah, it's this
Exxon or whatever.
this great distillation of, the quote, like, we can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine the end of capitalism.
Yes, which is a
Right.
theme we will come back to.
Right. Like they just
Frederick
can't.
Jameson, Mark Fisher.
Frederick
Yes.
Jameson, Mark Fisher. It's like, even when you are in the world of this pretty well written, pretty subtle, pretty grounded alien invasion movie, we cannot separate from the power of an import of capitalism.
Yeah, no, I think that's
Out of my
really
cold dead hand, will you take the Dow Jones?
yeah, exactly.
You may take
So
my guns, but never the stock market.
no, exactly. So moving along in the plot, the military approaches her, and she's a linguist, and the aliens are trying to communicate with humans, but so far, no luck, right? And there's a great scene. This colonel arrives, and he just kind of drops a pocket recorder in front of her, and,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
starts
yeah.
playing something that's like,
That looks like it's from Radio Shack in 1989. It's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. It looks like the kind of thing you have if you're in a band and you want to record your
yeah,
concert from the
right.
audience, like that
Right.
kind of thing. And she goes, "Is that?" And he's like, "No, it's like a clip from the Flintstones movie in the '90s."
Yeah.
Like
Oh
what?
no. Yeah.
Like,
Pocket record. Sorry. This is the actual alien.
like, like what? Yes, it's the aliens he's playing for you, obviously. And she says, "Oh well, I can't do it unless I can be there." And they say, "No way." Out of the question. She's
Out of the
like, "Oh,
question.
too bad." And he says, "Well, you translated that Farsi terrorist video for us so effortlessly. What's the difference here?" And it's like, buddy, like Farsi is like a human language.
Right.
You
Right.
can
Right.
like go to a university class and learn to speak it.
Right. And it's almost like he's suspicious that she's withholding her ability from them briefly. Well, it wasn't so hard with the Farsis. And then
Like
isn't
you
she
made,
like,
she said, he says, you made such quick work of that Farsi terrorist video. And she says, and you made such quick work of those terrorists.
right, which
Uh,
suggests that maybe they're concerned about bringing on what is apparently a full-on communist, right?
like,
They're concerned about her politics.
she's part of the woke left. She's
Right. But
anticipating.
but so then
The,
what does she do? What is her response?
she says, well, if I can't go there, then forget it.
Right. And
So
they apparently at first,
she goes home. Like
yeah, yeah,
that's
they
it.
like immediately draw the line like she wouldn't actually have to be there. It makes no sense at all. Like that
No,
they
no,
would
it's
what
ridiculous.
they're gonna like zoom her in to talk with the alien because like out of security concerns she can't be on the site.
Yeah, and then she goes home, but late at night, what happens? Helicopters. Oh my gosh! Turns out whatever other expert they had wasn't
Danvers.
Danvers. He wasn't cutting it,
He wasn't cutting it,
and
no.
so they agree to her demands and they take her to the site. And from there, we move into the portion of the film in which she's directly engaging with these aliens in an attempt to discern their sort of hieroglyphic like squid writing, right? Because they appear to be sort of cephalopod aliens. They live in this. There's a viewing room where they can go and see them. Gravity is all awry in their ship. It's very cool, and they appear to be kind of like big octopuses. We also get to meet her helper, played by Jeremy Renner,
Yeah,
Ian.
her
Uh,
helper, who's like apparently a breathtaking genius of a mathematician who plays
yeah,
precisely no role in the
yeah,
events
he
other
has
other
not.
than to look at her and fall in love and be like, "You are so good at your job."
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
he doesn't contribute anything that we see. Maybe there were cuts, maybe there was some scene where he triangulates something, uses logarithms to, but that's not in the film. In the film, he is entirely a prop. He's a love interest, and when they're working on figuring out that language, he sort of acts out. He becomes like a mime almost, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's walking. It's
uh,
like Ian is walking.
right, right. Which is one of my favorite scenes in the film. It's quite charming. Um, Now, like, there's another aspect of the film, which is there's a kind of there's occasional unrest that the film points us towards, right? Like we
Yeah,
see that not everywhere in the world is kind of taking this the same way. And in China, initially after the aliens have arrived, it seems like there's collaboration, right? We see
right.
scenes where she's kind of video conferencing with scientists in Pakistan. Even the hated enemy of America, China, is sort of collaborating with
Right. They're
this
sharing
effort.
their discoveries at first.
And but then along the way, we learned that China is ruled in this alternate reality by a sort of totalitarian dictator General
Yeah.
Shang, who's great, who rules. I love General Shang, uh, and they're maybe a little more skeptical. We eventually learned that if they've been using mahjong, the classical Chinese tabletop game, which is a sort of zero sum outcome game. And so there's some worry that maybe uh, the the way that they're using this game as the sort of linguistic template, that might lead to an unnecessarily adversarial relationship between humans and
Right.
the
This is where you
aliens,
get
right?
like a lot of the pro-American propaganda out because
Yeah, and it's very
it's
silly.
literally
Yeah,
like if anyone's gonna start the violence, it's China, while we're just out here really trying to
yeah.
figure out how
China doesn't share our egalitarian
our humanist
aim.
principles. Yeah.
It's it's like, okay, guys, like, really, this is ridiculous. And
Right, but they even as they start to document a bit of the unrest and while the political tensions and military tensions build up, they still like are sort of grounded in this reality that like could never be. Like they announced that there's a march on Washington. People are protesting the
they say
reaction to this.
800,000 people have
Yeah,
marched
yeah,
on Washington.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's like 800,000 people, that's like a lot of people, but it's not particularly impressive as far
It's
as
like
like,
the amount of people who went to like the rally to restore sanity led by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert.
yeah.
You know, it's like or like maybe like Obama's inauguration, but you know, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
there would be millions and millions
Right.
of people
Like 15
descending
mil
on
15
right,
million
right,
people march on Washington. I think that would be a
right.
little bit more impressive.
Right. And like
And
the government having to like fend off protests from environmentalists because you know, famously the concerns of the environmentalists have been so present in every
so
crisis.
influential
Yes,
on the
yeah.
actions of the government. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
The military is pretty skeptical of our scientists' efforts at directly communicating. Initially, when they go into the heptapod, which is what we learned, they're called heptapods because they have 7 legs, right? And Amy Adams tears off her suit, and then Jeremy Renner, on seeing her do this, does the same. And the military are like, "Oh no!" Like they're kind of, there's a classic sort of army versus scientist kind of uh,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the
conflict.
military characters are essentially plot points, right? They're
Yeah,
just like totally absurd obfuscation where the tension, you know, I think probably to deal with there's some pretty obvious third act problems, right? They need to start to like shoehorn because they do some cool slow stuff with the language
right.
that as a result, there's just like all he ever says over and over is like the guys upstairs want to blow him up. You better hurry up. You know, like that's basically
Yeah, and like the colonel is like, you're not, you're just using like kindergarten words with these guys, like what?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And she's like very patient. She's like, well, I have to determine, like, if they understand what like to be means before we
Right.
start, like like the military people are very stubborn in an almost in just completely, as you say, plot based way. They're just an
Yeah,
obstacle.
they're somehow smart enough to know they need to get a linguist on this ASAP, but don't spend any time thinking about what that actually apparently would mean, right?
Yeah. Another thing we see in this is that we mentioned this already. This is very pre-Trump, right? I think there's one cutaway to a kind of Rush Limbaugh-esque conspiracy type right wing,
Well, not
you know.
not this is a difference though, right? Not conspiracy type. His response
Yeah.
is just militarism.
Right.
It's very much of that era. It's like the right just want to go in, regime change the
Guns
shit out of these
blazing.
aliens, go in
Yeah.
guns blazing, ask questions later or whatever. And I do think it's really interesting in terms of showing, where the thinking was at this time. It is
There's
inconceivable that you could make this movie today without like a kook conspiracy character, probably also in the levels of government even. But you never hear anyone, like, if it was made today, you would definitely have a sequence of events where someone is like, maybe they're not even aliens at all. Maybe the left-wing government built these to scare us and control the population, right? Like, that is nowhere to be seen in this movie.
yeah, yeah. No, it's dated in that regard, right? There's no QAnon,
It it
there's
feels
no
it feels quaint. It feels
conspiracy.
quaint
It
in that way.
feels quaint. One thing we eventually learn is this idea that she brings up is the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about the nature of language.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that at all?
I mean, only from the vaguest sense of watching the movie and kind of piecing together what's going on.
So it's actually pretty controversial. Like it's not really accepted. It's also quite old, but the basic idea is that like the language that you speak and that you think in effect sort of shapes the way that you interact with and perceive the world around you, right?
Okay.
um and as Amy Adams character sort of continues to get make progress in understanding, she starts to suspect that like the nature of the alien language is something that uh if you could
Humans have
learn.
yet to really conceive.
Right. That if you could fully learn the language, you might be able to start to see the world in the way that the aliens, the heptapods, see the world. And everything's going well until in one of their translation efforts, one of the words they discover, they translate as weapon. So
Uh-oh.
once there's talk of weapon, like another thing we should
Let's
add
go get
is,
our weapons. Let's go get
yeah.
our weapons.
One thing we should add is that while um, this collaboration has been going well with the other countries. As soon as weapon comes up, it all ends. Also, the whole time Amy Adams has been working on this, uh, there's been a CIA minder who's there, like,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
make
yeah.
sure that, like, geopolitical realpolitik considerations are like
Right, right.
kept as we like engage with the aliens, right?
Yeah. The most
Uh,
important thing is that America retains its status as a superpower.
Yeah, no, I mean exactly. And the other aliens are in other countries. They're in Russia. There's one in China, of course. There's one in Sudan. It seems like the aliens have just kind of landed pell-mell across the globe. Initially, I was like, oh, is it like they're only landing in nuclear power? No, it's like Sudan.
Right.
Sudan is not a nuclear nation, obviously. So and it feels like you're gonna have to like work you're gonna have to work together, but this talk of weapon immediately puts an end to that. And in fact, China has decided, you know what, game over. We are we're going to war with the aliens. Right?
Right, right, right. Which again, it sort of speaks to the initial point. Everyone starts to arm up.
Yeah.
And there's no one ever who is like, wait a minute, what if they have super like previously unconceived ability A? What if their vessel can refract every weapon we throw at it and simultaneously destroy our entire planet?
Yeah.
Have we
And
even, like, it's still just this conventional idea of scaring this entity that you have no idea about its capabilities to save you or destroy you.
yeah, and as this is happening, a kind of rogue splinter group within the military slips a bomb
Yeah.
into the alien viewing chamber, which
Yeah, that
explodes.
that that should do it.
But the aliens save Jeremy Renner and Amy Adams, thank God.
Mhm.
But one of the aliens is killed by the bomb. And then there's this weird scene where Amy Adams kind of sneaks off and goes up by herself because the aliens sort of retreat a little bit, and she goes up by herself. And it's at this point that she finally grasps that the word is not weapon; it's could also be translated as tool, and that the tool is the language itself. Right. So this sort of
Right.
Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was the correct way of thinking about this interaction, right? And that basically the aliens experience time differently than we do. The
Right.
nature of their language allows them to experience time non-linearly, which is a complicated concept, but is one that is pretty well worn in sci-fi, right?
Right. But
Like,
then armed with that knowledge, she also like they still are able to create a movie in which the problem is solved by the one true remaining American hero,
well,
right?
that's true. I mean,
The
we'll get
chosen
into.
one here.
I want to get into that in a second, but like a couple books that come to mind: Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt
Sure.
Vonnegut, Billy Pilgrim is Unstuck in Time, right? That's a sort of governing trope. Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. The titular character, Dr. Manhattan, well, not titular, but one of the main characters, Dr. Manhattan, he has this physics accident where he's essentially dematerialized, but through some magic of comic book, he pulls himself back together and becomes able to manipulate all matter, with the consequence also that he also experiences time non-linearly. So one thing about nonlinear time is that if you can see everything you're going to do in the future, it becomes very deterministic, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
like it sort of takes free will out of it. It's like, well, this is what's going to happen, and you just kind of have to go along knowing that that's gonna, and
Right.
that's why the aliens knew that the military was going to bomb them, and that one of the two interlocutors was going to be
Well, and
killed
the reason that they're there is they know that they'll need the help of the humans
in
in
3,000
the
years or
distant
what.
future. Yeah,
Yeah,
3,000
exactly.
years.
So it's interesting. They Once Amy Adams' character has discerned this, she's actually able to use
The
this
gift
ability to prevent the gift, to
or the
prevent
weapon.
the weapon, if you will, the tool, to prevent the Chinese from making a terrible mistake in nuking the aliens, right? And she kind of goes into the future and is at a UN banquet celebrating like 6 months since we defeated the or since the aliens like visited us or
Yeah.
whatever. And she's meeting with our beloved General Shang. And like this comes to what you were mentioning before. Like one of my biggest issues with this movie is that it relies on the fantasy of the genius,
Yep.
right? That Amy Adams is so smart that she figures this thing out that no one else in the whole world has figured out. All the collective action ultimately means nothing because Amy Adams, gets the key. And also, she can solve the sort of geopolitical element because China is controlled by General Shang, the one great man who is
Right. Right.
like
Right.
the Napoleon of China, who's just like
Right.
has
Right.
absolute, so that like the whole resolution of the conflict occurs because of the intersection of these two very powerful and very gifted individuals, right?
Well, it's interesting because it is like it's actually kind of fitting for the time that we exist in, but it's portrayed as a happy ending in the world we live in. It's like it's this delusion, right? On the one hand,
Yes.
you got the genius techno solutionists who are going to figure out, how to like make salt water drinkable in time, or all of these things that are going
Right.
to
Some
save us
some
from environmental doom.
Einsteinian person is going to
Yes,
come along and they're going
Elon
to put
Musk,
it.
perhaps.
Yeah, maybe. Knock on wood. Let's hope.
And then the
Uh,
great man, you've got like people who ascribe to like the idea that Trump is going to like figure out everything and save
Yeah, and just
America
end
from.
the deep state and cause
Yes,
corruption and like usher
right,
in a sort of utopia, right?
right, right.
Which is
And
ridiculous.
I think that that sort of though speaks to the bigger, I mean, a the idea of the podcast, but also the cultural and sort of political moment as it relates to apocalyptic thinking, apocalyptic
Yeah,
culture, is that I truly think that part of the obsession with it and the proliferation of it is born of a true feeling of hopelessness of any sort of legitimate political avenue, legitimate form of dissent, any way of really reckoning with whether it's climate change or, um, resource scarcity, anything that is coming our way, we seem so far away from being able to handle it that descending into these sort of like meditations on it, and critiquing those,
yeah,
right? And being critical of those is an outlet for people who I think at least some subconscious level are petrified
yeah.
about the state of affairs and see no way, maybe outside of the delusion of the genius or the delusion of the great man, from escaping this seemingly like intractable nightmare that we're in.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting is another reveal we get at the end of the film is that those flashbacks we've seen periodically throughout the movie of the sick daughter, turns out those are not flashes back. They're in fact flashes forward, right? And then
Yeah.
what will happen is that Amy Adams will fall in love with Jeremy Renner. They will have this child who will have this terminal illness, who will pass away. Jeremy Renner will realize that she had used the alien language to know this was going to happen and went through with it anyway. And he will leave her because of that. And so there's a kind of like fatalistic aspect to the movie. There's this idea that like I know I'm going to have this daughter who's going to die and it's going to be terrible, but I'll know
But
that
every moment is worth living.
yeah,
Yeah.
that like having the daughter, even with her sort of horizons limited by illness and death, is still worth it because of the value and beauty that we get to experience together in that
Well,
brief time
and
that
I
we
think
have.
the value and beauty that how in the redefinition of life with this ability to conceive of, the nonlinear,
Right,
that
because if you can live every moment at once, you can essentially keep going back to that time you had with your
that's right.
daughter, right? So
Right.
that the daughter's limited lifespan is no longer so limited if it can be infinitely revisited through the power of this language. One
Right.
other thing about the movie that's very strange is so she writes a book we see in the future
Would
uh,
never happen.
about how to have this language
I
ability
mean, would never.
yourself.
I'm sorry, it would never happen. I mean, just think about it for one second. You have this military who stands in the way of all of this and is so concerned about any
And
of
then
this
someone even they
information
even
getting
try to
out.
bomb the aliens, right?
And
Like
you're telling me that now you can just go to Barnes and Noble and figure out how to escape the confines of your linear thinking pattern?
yeah,
No fucking
and you're gonna
chance are
keep going.
humans.
You're gonna keep going to work after you've escaped linear
Oh my
thinking, and
God.
you're gonna be a useful cog in the machine, right?
Right, right.
But again, this sort of tautological nature of this ability, where like there's a causation loop, right? Because she goes into the future, she gets this information from General Shang, that then back in the past she calls him in the present of that. This is all very convoluted and repeats words to him that he has just told her in the future that convince him that the power of the heptapods is good and that they shouldn't nuke the heptapods or whatever, right? And so there's a causality, right? Like it, the the past happens because of something in the future that happens in the past. It's like there's no way that doesn't make sense, like strictly logically speaking, right? But because how do you get to that future if she doesn't have the conversation that she has in the future and the past? It's just
Sure, sure.
like and I think we should talk a little bit about like what would this world be like? Like how many people do you think would learn to speak heptapod in the future where they have this outside of time perceptive ability?
I mean, would you do that?
I don't know if I'd want to, right? Because
Exactly. I don't think I can't even handle linear thinking.
yeah,
Like I'm having a tough enough time with the illusion of free will. I'm not ready to fucking dance that dance. I mean, again, like I don't know. I can't even really think of how people would go about their day to day. I mean, I just like I don't know
yeah,
who's working run of the mill jobs. There's no sense that this is going to lead to like some social utopia.
Well,
They're
no,
just,
I think there sort of is it is implied that
I don't
like
know. She's still,
global conflict is over. They're at the ball at the
yeah,
UN. They're
but there's still
meeting.
a UN. There's still a ball. There's still like this elitist classist structure
Right, right.
that
Like
clearly
there aren't a
exists.
bunch of they're not a
Right.
bunch of homeless people at the UN ball with them.
Right. While
Right. It's
there's
yeah,
some guy like holding a boom mic so that the newscasts can carry on. As though
yeah,
like
yeah,
now that he can conceive of the world this way, he's like, I'm gonna go put makeup on Wolf Blitzer so that
yeah, yeah,
CNN
yeah,
can
yeah,
carry on.
yeah.
Like, I mean, and another thing that I think is interesting, and maybe we will start to see in future episodes is uh speaking of it as a movie of its time, or at least a previous feeling, there still is happy ending,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And I think that that's kind of like that's like, and
That's
who
quite
knows how some,
unusual. A lot of apocalypse movies tend to end badly, strangely. I mean,
yeah, and I think that again, if you made this movie now, I'm not sure that it would be a happy ending, and maybe there would be a section where humans crumble under the weight of this new knowledge, that it feels like we're moving explicitly into this realm where for something to be truly gritty and real and prestige, it almost has to be a disastrous, or
it has to be dark. Yeah, yeah.
it has
I
to be
mean, I
super
think
dark. Yeah.
ultimately it's like it's a pretty good movie. It's fun that
Yeah.
that it toys with this idea of like seeing the world through different eyes or through a different modality, right? Of like completely renovating our perception on reality. Um,
Right. But like ultimately where it fails for me is that it does that, but cannot apply the same level of imagination to like the basic workings of humanity that would
yeah.
come completely apart at the seams within hours of this, arrival.
Yeah, and I think like its focus on the idea of like a complete renovation of thinking is useful when you think about something like climate change. Like
Yeah.
clearly like our current attitudes towards the environment, towards the world we live in, towards each other, is not going to cut it for
Right.
reversing this like already hundreds of
Right.
years in process, like dramatic cataclysmic shift in the carbon, in the
Yeah,
atmosphere.
it's interesting to think of the idea that the movie brings up about the trappings of linear thinking, and as you apply it to the way that we approach these crises, right? Which is that like
Yeah,
I don't know if this was actually real or a sort of a mythical idea of politics and society, but it feels to me as I've gotten older that
mm.
there has been even less genuine consideration of future generations. I mean, I
Oh
know that
yeah.
it's always been a political tool to be like to leave the world better than
Won't somebody think
or
of the
your
children, right?
or
Yeah,
the
yeah,
or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren. That
yeah.
sort of like long term thinking,
You
I
don't
think,
hear
is
that
sort
as
of
it
like,
doesn't get invoked as
yeah,
much.
and like the prison of the present moment seems to be what we're really stuck in, and why we can't really think, never mind like how ridiculous it is that a newscast would still be on when aliens arrive. Like we can't even think of a world where as we run out of resources and water, we should, stop hiding misshapen vegetables from
Yeah,
the Whole Foods to disturb the humdrum American consumer.
yeah. No, I think that's right. So I think like ultimately, like I like the idea that a radical change in perspective is what we need, that the movie kind of proposes. But I feel like ultimately the kind of whole thing hinging upon the magical genius and the all-powerful dictator,
Right, right,
meeting at the center to like snap their fingers and like result, it is ultimately not that helpful as far as thinking about actual problems in the
right.
world that we
And
face
if
today.
anything, illustrative of part of our current problem.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. All right, well, I think that's pretty good. Do you have any other last thoughts on Arrival that you'd like to share?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think if I was generously, I would say that obviously I have been giving it a very hyper realist reading. And the one thing I would say to its credit is that, it probably just the movie doesn't have time to address all of the
Yeah,
things
I
that
mean,
would really happen.
there's a
So
sense in the
they're
third act,
focused on
especially,
the,
that there was
yeah,
other stuff in this that was cut out. Because I feel like,
that's
especially
right.
with the bomb plot and stuff, it just kind of you kind of rush into that, and then we're at the end with General Shang, it feels like
Yeah,
there
you
was
almost you almost get the feeling that they're like the writers and the people making it are like look, guys, like this is already plenty smart enough. We could wrap this up. We've
Yeah.
we've earned it. You can see them be like, we've earned this third act where everything is so obvious and the bomb is threatened, and we get the fuck out of the writer's room
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
like we've already given them so much,
So much food for
play,
thought, so to
food for
speak. Yeah.
thought, exactly, which we
Yeah,
hope to do in the future,
that's
right?
the dream. So what are we talking about next week?
Next week, we are moving into the more current landscape, as we talked about
Yes.
at the beginning, the movement of the apocalyptic piece into the landscape of high television, prestige television, with the very gritty, very dark The Last of Us.
Yes, yes. And another take on the apocalypse, and one that's quite interesting. I think we'll have a lot of good stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
So be sure to subscribe and
To
tell
the
your.
End of the World with Michael and Stu.
And I'm Stu,
And I'm Michael.
and we'll see you next time.